This tutorial on electing our bishops is presented by Dr. Joseph F. O'Callaghan, Professor Emeritus of Medieval History at Fordham University. He is the former director of the Center for Medieval Studies at Fordham and a past president of the American Catholic Historical Association. Professor O'Callaghan is an authority on medieval Spain and medieval institutions. He is the author of the book, Electing Our Bishops, How the Catholic Church Should Choose Its Leaders, published by Rowman and Littlefield in 2007.
In the wake of the scandal of priestly sexual abuse and episcopal cover-up, the faithful are right to demand that their bishops be accountable for their actions. One means of establishing accountability is to return to the ancient tradition of the Church that provided for the election of bishops by the clergy and people of the diocese. Currently, the Pope appoints and transfers bishops who are responsible only to him and not to the people entrusted to their care. From the beginning, the Christian community, recognizing the need for leaders, elected them from its members. The election of Matthias to replace Judas and of the 7, traditionally regarded as the first deacons, are examples of that. Early liturgical texts such as the Didache, or the teaching of the 12 apostles, and the apostolic tradition of Hippolytus of Rome testify to the election and ordination of bishops. In the middle of the 3rd century, St. Cyprian, Bishop of Carthage in North Africa, emphasized that by virtue of divine authority, the bishop should be elected by all the faithful, and that the provincial bishops, after consenting to the election, should ordain the one elected. The inspiration of the Holy Spirit sometimes prompted a spontaneous election, as in the instance of St. Ambrose, who was elected Bishop of Milan in 373. 2 5th-century popes were emphatic in affirming the right of the clergy and people to elect their bishops. Pope Celestine I stated clearly, quote, "No one who is unwanted should be made a bishop. The desire and consent of the clergy and people is required," end quote. About 30 years later, Pope Leo I, the Great, declared, quote, "The one who is to be head over all should be elected by all," end quote. He added, quote, "When the election of the chief priest is being considered, the one whom the unanimous consent of the clergy and people proposes should be put forward. It is essential to exclude all those unwanted and unasked for, if the people are not to be crossed and end by despising or hating their bishop. If they cannot have the candidate that they desire, the people may all turn away from religion unduly," end quote. Church councils, both provincial and ecumenical, reiterated the principle that the bishop should be chosen by the clergy and people assembled in a synod together with the archbishop and the other provincial bishops. When Christianity was acknowledged as a legal religion in the Roman Empire in the 4th century, ambitious men coveted the office of bishop, and emperors intruded into the electoral process by imposing their candidates. Imitating their example, the Germanic kings who ruled the western provinces of the empire also insisted on nominating bishops. Challenging those claims, 11th century reformers insisted on free elections, but in practice, the royal or imperial right to nominate the bishops remained intact. During the 12th century, both the ordinary clergy and laity were effectively excluded from the electoral process. The election was entrusted to an elite body of priests, the canons of the cathedral chapter, who functioned as the bishop's council. In reality, their task was a mere formality of approving the monarch's choice rather than independently electing their own man. The Council of Trent in the 16th century debated the wisdom of returning to the ancient tradition of popular election of bishops, but ultimately strengthened papal influence over episcopal elections. Thereafter, secular rulers working closely with the papacy controlled the appointment of bishops. From the 18th century onward, the papacy entered a series of concordats or agreements conceding to secular rulers the right to name bishops subject to papal approval. Meanwhile, John Carroll, the first American bishop, was elected by his priests in 1789, but thereafter the Pope appointed the bishops. Lamenting the poor quality of the American bishops, witnesses attacked the system of episcopal appointments on the grounds of secrecy, patronage, intrigue, and the failure to consult priests. The provincial bishops and some priests were eventually asked to draw up a list of 3 nominees from which the Pope could select one, but the laity had no role in the choice of their bishops. The Code of Canon Law in 1917 and the revised code in 1983 forthrightly stated the papal right to appoint all the bishops. Agreements with Mussolini, Hitler, and Franco confirmed that right, provided that the government had no political objection to the candidates. The irony is that secular rulers who were often non-Catholic or anti-clerical, or in the 20th century, irreligious dictators hostile to Catholicism, had a greater voice in choosing bishops than faithful Catholics. In the Church today, scarcely any vestige remains of the ancient tradition of popular election of bishops. Rather, throughout the Latin Church, the notion that the Pope, without challenge, appoints the bishops as he wishes is generally accepted. In 1972, the Vatican issued a series of norms for the selection of bishops, which were later incorporated into the Code of Canon Law of 1983. In actuality, as Thomas Rees emphasized, the papal nuncio has the principal role in gathering information about a candidate's orthodoxy, loyalty to the Pope, and his stand on celibacy, the ordination of women, and sexual morality. After weighing the nuncio's report, the Congregation for Bishops makes a final recommendation to the Pope. John Tracy Ellis, one of the great historians of the American Church, observed the incongruity of entrusting to the nuncio, a foreigner with no pastoral office in the United States, the principal role in choosing the bishops. Pope John Paul II had the opportunity to appoint nearly all the current bishops of the world. Not surprisingly, they were characterized principally by their fidelity to the papacy. As Richard Ghilardi pointed out, the successful candidate would likely enjoy the patronage of a cardinal, have a Roman education, have served in the curia, or as a seminary professor or rector. Most importantly, he would, quote, have no record of having written or said anything that might be construed as critical of official magisterial pronouncements or church policies. Notably absent from this list is demonstrated ability as a pastoral leader. Presumably, this qualification is currently viewed as ecclesiastical gravy, end quote. The transfer of bishops has become increasingly common, so much so that it seems like an embarrassing game of episcopal musical chairs. Bishops are seldom chosen to govern a diocese where they served as priests, and thus are strangers to both the priests and people committed to their care. Smaller dioceses are often viewed as stepping stones to more important prizes. In ancient times, by analogy with Christ as the bridegroom of the church, the bishop was said to be wedded to his see, and the ring was the visible sign of that nuptial bond. Pope Calixtus I portrayed a bishop who transferred from one see to another as a spiritual adulterer. Vatican officials, including Joseph Ratzinger, now Pope Benedict XVI, lamented the careerism of men ambitious for promotion to more prestigious and wealthier sees. Ironically, Ratzinger was unfaithful to Munich, the diocese for which he was first ordained, and accepted election as Bishop of Rome. Theologians, canonists, and church historians pointed to the need to reform the current system of selecting bishops, and especially to broaden the participation of the clergy and people. The Jesuit Michael Buckley warned, for example, that, quote, if the present system for the selection of bishops is not addressed, all other attempts at serious reform will founder, and ever greater numbers of Catholics will move toward alienation, disinterest, and affective schism, end quote. In 1973, the Canon Law Society of America proposed a procedure for the selection of bishops. A diocesan committee consisting of 2 priests, 2 female religious, 2 male religious, 2 laymen, and 2 lay women should enlist the faithful every 3 years, in assessing diocesan needs, determining the qualities desired in a bishop, and identifying 3 priests likely to best serve the diocese. The names and accompanying recommendations would be forwarded up the hierarchical chain, eventually reaching the Congregation for Bishops in Rome. The input of the laity, however, was limited to the initial work of the committee. Voice of the Faithful in the Diocese of Bridgeport has also